Our second reading comes to us from the Gospel of Matthew. It is found in Matthew chapter 5, beginning with verse 13. Listen for the word of God. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. People do not light a lamp and put it under a bushel basket. Rather, they put it on the lampstand and give light to all the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until it is all accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is the gospel of the Lord. And a bit of a bummer. Full disclosure, I don't like talking about the law. It makes me cranky, frankly. I hate arguing about it even more. And yes, it seems to be one of those things that has been a subject of argument far too many times in my own personal life. It's no secret that I was not always a religious person, certainly not a Christian person. In my days as an atheist, I think one of the things that annoyed me the most was the constant misuse of this thing we call God's law. It was offensive and upsetting and hurtful. And as I stand before you today, now a Christian minister, it is still abused, harmful, weaponized, and completely and utterly misrepresented in religious culture. So it's no wonder that when I read the passage about Jesus talking about the idea of fulfilling the law, I get a little bit of a twitch, I'll be honest. I'm sure other people do too. I'm not the only person who has been traumatized or attacked using this thing we call the law of God. So let's have a conversation about this crazy little thing we call the law. The word itself, law, is kind of a power word in Christian circles. If you invoke the law of God, how can anybody argue with you? And our arguments about the idea of law tend to happen as a battle of two extremes. The literalists, or perhaps more conservative voices, speak of the law as literal, black and white, unable to be altered, changed, or in any way different. The same law written centuries and centuries ago is the same law that we are supposed to be following here today. It's the law that was written in the book, and you must follow it or else. It's a legalistic view of law that leaves no room for change, transformation, evolution, God forbid, or interpretation. Others, we'll call them, I suppose, the more progressive wing of the argument, have decided that the arrival of Jesus negates the Old Testament law completely. So the prophets and the Old Testament can just be thrown out the window. They have no more value in our modern world. I admit that I was once a part of that particular philosophy. In order to survive, I had to throw out Old Testament law because I found it hurtful and upsetting. I have since evolved. Because somewhere between those two extremes is the reality of what biblical law means for us. Let me begin by saying I cannot accept, I cannot support a legalistic and literal view of biblical law for many reasons, but here are two. First, there is a certain degree of complete and utter hypocrisy and intellectual dishonesty in claiming to adhere to a literal set of laws when you are selective about which ones you actually adhere to. Selective living by the law. Off the top of my head, I don't know, maybe folks who attack folks like me, for example, while ignoring every single thing the Bible has ever said about divorce. I've never seen a sign that says God hates divorce being lobbied about in the streets. I know that I've been hated on, that many billboards and signs out in the public, and yet somehow we ignore that. I mean, let's be real here. Which Levitican laws guide your daily life? How many of you, for example, raise your hand if you have ever stoned to death your disobedient child? Because Leviticus says you can do that. I'm not quite sure which parent is responsible, but somebody's supposed to do it. Nobody?
Does threatening count?
Well, no, wanting to do it is different. And who's going to tell all of our bankers and financial titans that charging interest is a sin? That's in Leviticus too. That's part of Mosaic law. What about the forgiving of debts? The year of Jubilee, when we forgive everything. I have yet to see that happen in the many 50-year periods that have passed in the United States. There's a second reason that I often reject the literalist interpretation of biblical law, and this one is the simplest one. I have read the Bible. It is my opinion that in reading biblical texts that relate to the concept of law, we cannot help but notice that the law, from old to new, evolves throughout the text. If, for example, the law of Moses is your thing, and you think that Moses is absolutely beyond reproach, that every single thing Moses said stands etched in stone to this day, and you have decided that Levitican law is a non-negotiable piece of Mosaic law, what do you make of the fact that in Deuteronomy, Moses edits the law? In Moses' final speech to the people of Israel who are about to cross over into the promised land, Moses makes it very clear. Now, this is the commandment, he says, the statutes and ordinances that the Lord your God has charged me to teach you to observe in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy. They're about to renew their covenant with God in Moab prior to entering the promised land. And Moses' job is to reiterate every single aspect of law that they are supposed to live up to in this particular place. And so Moses gives, Deuteronomy is a gigantic, ginormous speech by Moses, reviewing law ad nauseum. It speaks about worship practices. It reviews the Ten Commandments. It talks about clean and unclean foods. Pork, by the way, folks, is still bad if Moses is your thing. It talks about the sabbatical year, various festivals, legal processes, rules of war and battle, laws concerning murder and cities of refuge, marriage and divorce and virginity. Oh, and stoning your kids is still there too. Various sanitation and economic regulations, strong condemnations of idolatry, rules about tithing. This is Moses' review of the law that he thinks is so massively important that God needs you to know it, and yet he leaves out massive portions of what we have come to call Levitican law. For example, in Deuteronomy, Moses speaks a lot about marriage and virginity. But in that section, which is subtitled Sexual Ethics, by the way, or Sexual Morals, my folks don't even get an honorary mention. In fact, most of the weird sexual ethics are edited out. Instead, Moses focuses on the idea of maintaining marriages and protecting virginity. Also, interestingly left out of Moses' review are all the rules related to the female curse. So apparently Moses no longer thought that menstruation was such a crucial issue that it deserved 50 paragraphs of conversation. Leprosy is still there. In fact, leprosy stands out as the most significant disease and uncleanness that Moses remarked on. Now, some folks tell me I should stop making a big deal of this. What isn't there doesn't matter, tell me. I have an issue with that, because it was there. It was there, and it isn't there anymore. It was there. If it hadn't been there in the first place, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But for some reason, Moses finds it important to edit the law. In fact, Moses himself will whittle the law down to one sentence: love your God. Jesus will add the second part later. But this is Moses talking before he can't go into the promised land. He's never going to talk about this again. He will die. He's about to die. So why leave anything else? Chapters and pages and pages and pages of review. And then, of course, Jesus arrives. And Jesus talks about this idea of fulfilling the law. Is he talking about fulfilling Levitican law or Mosaic law, the Old Testament law? Is he talking about the New Covenant? Was Jesus, God among us, the walking, talking law, the living law, bound to the holiness code of Levitican priests? Jesus, who shook the foundations of the temple, who would point out many times in his own way the hypocrisy of those who preach adherence to a law that they can't follow themselves. Was Jesus really intent on keeping things the same? Is that how we understand Jesus? Jesus came to protect the status quo of Old Testament law and the temple system. Of course not. Jesus made it clear that the preservation of the legalism and literalism that had plagued the ancient church was a root of corruption and abuse by that same church. In fact, Jesus will turn religious law into two statements: love God and love each other. That's the law that Jesus spoke about so much. Jesus framed the law in ways closer actually to the voices of the prophets than the voices of Levitican priesthood. Jesus and the prophets spoke of justice. They talked about caring for the sick, freeing the captives, equity for the poor, of ending oppression of the weak and the marginalized, of nations guided by God's call to justice, God's call to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly. Those words should seem familiar. And the words that we hear today, this weird, unsettling little conversation that Jesus has about the preservation of the law, take a moment to recognize where it is. It comes right after the Beatitudes. Blessed are those. And right after it comes Jesus's lengthiest discussion of the particulars of law. He talks about anger. He talks about anger being the same as murder. Holding on to anger is murdering. Thou shalt not kill. He talks about adultery. He talks about divorce. He talks about taking oaths. He talks about love your enemies. In fact, in his conversation about loving your enemies, he says, I bet you've heard people say it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It isn't. Let me reframe that for you. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Give to the poor. Jesus talks about prayer and fasting. And of course, the famous one-liner, you cannot love God and wealth. Somebody keep that away from the rich folks. And everything Jesus focuses on in this little speech after talking about the law, everything he focuses on falls into two categories: the ways that we love God and the ways that we love each other. The law of Jesus Christ is love. Love God, love your neighbor, full stop. Jesus makes massive attempts to explain to us the importance of loving God and loving each other. loving God, loving neighbor. This is the law that Paul will talk about being written on the human heart. Jesus was speaking to people who did not always have a conversant knowledge of Levitican code. And so when he expresses to these folks the nature of the law, he talks about the law of love. This law, the law of love that is written inside of us, is the law that God implanted in us the moment God breathed life into our bodies. The first law was love, the love of the Creator for creation. Suggesting that the law of God can only be found in one place at one time or in one people undermines the idea that God is alive, that God's community is expanding, and the biblical story is the story of an expanding community of people. God's constant outreach to more and more people who are less and less worthy in the eyes of religious folks to receive God's love. But God constantly is living and moving and growing this sense of community. Our desire to trap God in one place at one time and with one people undermines everything God teaches through both the law and the prophets. And we're talking about God here. This is the same God who will tell Peter, oh, by the way, all that tough stuff I told you not to eat, don't listen to that anymore. Eat whatever you need to. Peter interprets this as God saying, what God has made clean, I must not call profane. Who God has made clean, I must not call profane. God reiterating the idea that law is not a blank check to discriminate, hurt, or harm other people. It is supposed to be the path by which we expand community and love more. I mean, we either believe that Jesus is a living Savior or we don't. And everything that Jesus lived and taught and did in his life, everything that Jesus sacrificed, the moment of Jesus' resurrection, all of that stuff was intended to place us in what we now call the state of grace. I'm getting into Reformed theology here for a moment. We don't live under the law, we live under grace. Christ's grace, bought and paid for by his life. Do we really want to return that gift in favor of a legalism that Jesus himself could not, would not, and did not support? Denying God's expanding community rejects the concept of a living God. Trapping Jesus and God between the covers of the Bible renders them dead to us. We worship a living God, a God who will not be contained in chapters or books or churches for that matter. We live under the law of God's love and God's grace. The idea that the law has never evolved in the biblical history is insane. It has evolved many times. And if you want to be a literalist and a legalist, I'm sorry, folks, but it's all or nothing. That's the way it works. None of us can adhere to ancient laws. It's impossible. It's also ridiculous. Because on many fronts, it discounts so many things that we know now. Jesus did not banish lepers. Jesus healed them. That is what medical science is, folks. Healing disease, not casting them out of the city. Jesus welcomed strangers. He did not throw them out of his own country or nation or whatever. He certainly didn't put them in cages. Jesus ate with sinners. Jesus did not use the law. Jesus did not use Moses or any other concept to beat them over the heads. Jesus ate with them, showed them love, and showed them compassion, healed their sin even when they didn't ask for it. Jesus spent his entire life violating the law by hanging out with the wrong folks, shaking hands with the unclean, loving the unlovable, and healing the incurable. Law is a complicated concept, I admit that. And I guess maybe I'm more content to argue about it than I thought. But if nothing else, Jesus took away our permission to use this idea of law to hurt and to divide and to crush the faith and the spirit and the lives of other people. Jesus preached a gospel of peace, a law of love. Is that not the law that we are living under now? Is that not what Jesus is asking us for in this moment? So if you want to live in a world where Mosaic and Levitical law are the end all be all, God love you and God help you, because you can't do it. I'm not even sure we can even obey the top 10 adequately, frankly. But if you want to embrace the living law, the law that was embodied in the person of Christ, God among us, who spoke to us of new truth and new ways. Christianity was called the new way. If you want to embrace that law, then you need to do two things. Love God, love each other, full stop. Amen.